She had mastered the art of being unseen. In a world of glass towers and polished ambition, Evelyn moved quietly, the woman who kept everything running, yet was noticed by no one. Every morning, she brewed her coffee by hand, listened to her old radio, and walked to work with the kind of calm that hides 1,000 quiet heartbreaks. To her millionaire boss, she was just another part of the background, efficient, reliable, invisible. But sometimes, life has a way of revealing what's been hidden too long. It began with something small, a simple bouquet of yellow tulips, and in that single gesture, a moment of being seen, the balance of everything began to shift. Jealousy, reflection, regret, redemption, all would follow. This is not just a story about love. It's a story about awakening, about how one woman's quiet grace could change even the coldest heart. Because sometimes, the most powerful transformations begin not with noise, but with silence finally being noticed. Stay with this story. Let it remind you that even in a world that overlooks you, being unseen does not mean you don't matter. The morning light in Portland had a way of touching everything softly, as if unsure whether the world was ready to wake. Inside a small apartment near the Willamette River, Evelyn Hart moved quietly through the rhythm of another ordinary day. Her life was a collection of small, deliberate rituals. She ground her coffee beans by hand, listening to the gentle hum of the old grinder, its sound steady and familiar, like an old friend who never asked for anything in return. The scent of roasted beans filled the air, mingling with the faint music from a radio that had long since lost its shine. The voice on the broadcast crackled faintly, announcing the weather, the traffic, the same things she already knew by heart. Evelyn's apartment was neat, almost too neat, with everything in its place. The books were arranged by size, the curtains tied back just enough to let in the gray morning light, and a single plant stood on the windowsill, a stubborn green survivor, much like her. Outside, the river drifted by in silence. Some mornings she'd pause at the window, mug in hand, watching the boat slide across the misty water. There was comfort in their direction, in their purpose. Unlike people, the river never forgot where it was going. By 7:30, she was out the door. Her heels clicked softly on the sidewalk, her coat buttoned high against the chill. The city was waking too, cars merging into the stream of life, coffee shops opening their doors, strangers passing without meeting eyes. Evelyn walked the same route she always did, 3 blocks north, 1 west, past the bakery that smelled like butter and hope, and down the avenue where glass towers began to claim the sky. Caldwell Designs stood at the corner, a tall, flawless building of steel and glass. It looked like something that belonged in a magazine spread, gleaming and confident. People moved briskly through the revolving doors, each with somewhere to be, something to prove. Evelyn stepped inside. The air was cool, the lighting perfect, the hum of ambition almost tangible. She nodded politely to the receptionist, offered a faint smile to the security guard, and made her way to her desk tucked near the corner, where the sunlight barely reached. Her colleagues greeted her with quick, distracted hellos. Some smiled without looking, others simply walked by, phones in hand, conversations already miles away. Evelyn didn't mind. She had learned long ago that being invisible was easier than being disappointed. Her desk was immaculate, files neatly stacked, pens aligned, calendar marked in gentle handwriting. She opened her computer and began sorting through the morning's emails quietly, efficiently, without calling attention to herself. No one noticed that she was the one who kept the projects on track, who caught mistakes before they became disasters, who remembered birthdays and deadlines alike. To them, Evelyn was simply there, reliable, steady, unremarkable. But to the building itself, the heartbeat beneath the glass, she was the rhythm that kept it alive. The hours slipped by in silence. She listened to the footsteps in the hallway, the distant laughter from a meeting room, the soft click of keyboards that filled the air like rain. Every so often, she'd glance up at the framed photographs of the company's milestones, James Caldwell shaking hands with investors, awards lined up like trophies of perfection. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without asking for it. Tall, precise, his words measured like architecture. And though Evelyn had worked under him for years, he had never once looked at her long enough to see who she really was. That didn't surprise her either. Some people live so high above the ground that they mistook silence for obedience and invisibility for peace. At noon, she warmed her soup in the break room microwave. The hum of the machine was louder than the conversations around her. She sat by the window, watching the reflection of the city shimmer across the glass. It wasn't loneliness she felt, it was something quieter, deeper. The kind of stillness that grows when life stops expecting to be seen. By the time the afternoon faded into the pale gold of evening, Evelyn had completed every task on her list. She shut down her computer, straightened the papers, and slipped into her coat once more. As she passed through the lobby, the receptionist waved a distracted goodbye. Evelyn smiled, though no one noticed. She stepped outside into the cool air, where the sky hung low over the river like a sheet of silver. Walking home, she thought about the day, the same faces, the same voices, the same patterns looping endlessly. And yet, there was a strange comfort in it all. The predictability, the quiet, the small certainty that, though unseen, she still made the world function in her own invisible way. At her apartment, she poured herself a glass of water and placed it beside the window. The city lights glittered on the surface like tiny stars trapped in a glass world. She let out a slow breath, her reflection merging with the city beyond. Another day, she whispered softly, to keep the world running, unseen. Outside, the wind stirred the curtains, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she smiled not from joy, but from the quiet pride of knowing that even the invisible can hold everything together. The next morning arrived with the same quiet rhythm, yet something about it felt heavier, like the air before a storm. Evelyn woke to the sound of rain brushing against her window, soft and persistent. The kind of rain that never announced itself, but simply stayed until it was done. She dressed in muted colors, her movements calm and careful, and walked her familiar route toward the city. The streets glistened under the gray sky, mirrors of a world that always seemed too busy to notice its own reflection. As she approached the tower of Caldwell Designs, the building rose before her like a monument of light and ambition. It was all glass miles of it, each panel polished to perfection, reflecting both the sky above and the people below. From the outside, it looked alive, breathing with motion, confidence, and control. But inside, it was colder. Every wall shimmered with transparency, yet hid so much silence. It was a place where success had a sound, the echo of heels on marble, the whisper of expensive suits, the clipped rhythm of efficiency. Everything and everyone moved with purpose, as if time itself had been trained to obey. At the top of this glass kingdom ruled James Caldwell. James was a man carved from precision. In his mid-40s, tall and impeccably dressed, he carried the kind of presence that bent a room toward him without saying a word. His hair, always in place, his voice, even and composed, his expression, unreadable. People often said he was born for leadership, calm under pressure, decisive, brilliant, but brilliance, like glass, can cut as easily as it reflects. James believed in systems. He trusted schedules, numbers, and blueprints more than he ever trusted people. People, after all, were unpredictable. They made mistakes. They had feelings. Buildings, on the other hand, stayed loyal to their design. As he once thought quietly to himself, people are variables, buildings are predictable. That morning, he moved through the office with his usual calm intensity, reviewing reports, offering precise feedback, his eyes scanning without lingering. He had built this company from the ground up, shaping it in his image a monument of order. And yet, somewhere deep within that order, small cracks had begun to appear. One of those cracks had a name, Evelyn Hart. She stood at her desk, reviewing the latest presentation he was due to deliver within the hour. Her handwriting filled the margins with quiet corrections, thoughtful notes that no one but James would ever read. She knew his preferences, the kind of charts he favored, the phrasing that aligned with his tone. She had spent years learning his rhythm without ever sharing a conversation longer than a few sentences. When James walked by, the air seemed to tighten. Evelyn lifted her head slightly, a reflex more than an expectation. He passed within inches of her, the faint scent of cedar cologne trailing behind. His eyes fixed ahead. The report she had prepared her quiet labor of days was in his hands, but he didn't see her. Not really. To him, she was part of the background, a cog in the machine that kept his empire running smoothly. If the morning coffee was there, if the numbers balanced, if the meeting flowed without interruption, then everything was as it should be. He had built a life where things were noticed only when they failed, and Evelyn, in her quiet perfection, never failed. Yet there was something in the way she moved steady, unhurried, that unsettled him in ways he didn't understand. Perhaps it was her calm, so different from his restless control, or perhaps it was the way she seemed to belong to the quiet itself. While James ruled the world from the top floor, Evelyn held it together from below. He owned the world. She kept it from falling apart. From his office window, James looked out at the city that stretched endlessly in every direction. The glass around him mirrored his reflection back, sharp, composed, almost too precise. In moments like this, he felt comforted by the perfection he had built. The world below could falter, but up here, everything gleamed. Still, behind that gleam, there was an emptiness he rarely acknowledged. There were no fingerprints on glass walls, no laughter that lingered after meetings, no warmth in the air once the doors closed. Everything was spotless. Everything was distant. He turned his attention back to the folder in his hands, the one Evelyn had prepared. Every page was flawless. Every number lined up. Every sentence flowed with clarity and care. But he never wondered who had written it with such quiet devotion. He only noticed that it worked. Downstairs, Evelyn sat at her desk once more, sipping the last of her coffee as the rain began to clear. Through the window's reflection, she could see the faint outline of the top floor, the world where decisions were made. She imagined James there, standing tall, unbothered by storms. And yet, something about the image made her heart ache in ways she didn't quite understand. Invisibility, she reminded herself, was not a curse. It was a kind of safety. She typed another email, reviewed another list, and moved through the day with her usual grace. Above her, James Caldwell continued his reign in the world of glass, perfect, gleaming, and blind to the quiet soul who made that perfection possible. And though they shared the same building, the same air, the same sun through the same panels of glass, they lived in different worlds, entirely one scene, one unseen. As the afternoon light broke through the clouds, the windows sparkled like diamonds. Evelyn looked up, and for a brief second, she thought she saw her own reflection merge with the towers. It was beautiful, fragile, and fleeting. And in that brief shimmer, the invisible woman and the man who never looked might have been standing side by side, each unaware of how soon the glass between them would begin to crack. The rain that had washed over Portland the day before left the city shining clean, but inside Caldwell Designs, a different kind of storm was gathering, one that no weather forecast could predict. Morning light poured through the walls of glass, bright and unfiltered, bouncing off polished surfaces until it felt almost harsh. People hurried to their desks, coffee in hand, voices low but urgent. There was tension in the air, thin, invisible, but unmistakable. Evelyn sensed it the moment she arrived. Years in that building had taught her to read the subtle shifts, the way footsteps quickened, the way laughter disappeared, the way silence grew heavy before a meeting. Today, silence ruled. The conference room on the 12th floor looked like something out of a magazine-long walnut table, chrome fixtures, a skyline view that stretched for miles. It was a room built for control, for confidence. But as the senior team gathered around, that confidence began to crumble. James Caldwell stood at the head of the table, his expression hard and unreadable. The morning report lay open in front of him, numbers scattered across the page like debris after an accident. Something was wrong, something small, but costly. Who signed off on this projection? His voice was calm, but the kind of calm that came before thunder. No one spoke. Papers shifted. Eyes fell to the table. Evelyn glanced down at the report, tracing the columns of data with her eyes. She knew instantly it wasn't hers. The miscalculation had come from another department, one that had rushed through the quarterly update. Still, she also knew what was coming. Her name was on the final file. When silence stretched too long, James looked directly at her. "Miss Hart," he said evenly, "I trust you reviewed these numbers before they were sent to me." Evelyn nodded once. "Yes, sir." "I did." The original data came from James cut her off, his tone sharper now. "Then perhaps you should have checked them more carefully." Around the table, no one moved. A few exchanged fleeting glances, sympathy mixed with relief that it wasn't them. Evelyn could have defended herself. She could have pointed out the source, traced the chain of approval, explained how she had stayed late correcting half of it already. But she didn't. She looked at her hands, then back at him. "I take responsibility," she said quietly. The words hung in the air like a thin thread, almost fragile, yet they carried the weight of her integrity. It wasn't submission, it was grace. James's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered confusion, perhaps, or frustration at her calmness. He turned away, closing the folder with a sharp motion that echoed in the stillness. "See that it doesn't happen again," he said, and walked out. For a moment, the room remained frozen. No one spoke, as if the sound itself might break something sacred. Then the whispers began, soft, careful, like wind through glass. A colleague leaned toward her, voice barely audible. "He'll never notice what you save," the woman said, "only what you miss." Evelyn gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "I know." When the room finally emptied, she stayed behind, standing by the window. The city stretched beneath her, small cars moving like quiet streams, bridges arching over the river, a world that went on, indifferent to one woman's quiet courage. The light hit her face through the glass, catching the curve of her cheek, the soft lines of fatigue around her eyes. She looked calm, almost serene, but inside her chest was the dull ache of being unseen once again. To be invisible was one thing, to be mistaken for the fault line was another. Down the hallway, James was pacing his office. His anger had already begun to fade, replaced by a restlessness he couldn't name. He didn't enjoy moments like that, confrontations that left a bitter taste. But in his world, control mattered more than comfort. Mistakes, no matter how small, were like cracks in the glass, and cracks spread. He told himself it was necessary. Leadership required distance. Still, a faint image lingered in his mind. Evelyn standing there, silent, accepting blame without fear. It unsettled him. He looked toward the window, toward the reflection of the city below, and for a fleeting moment, he saw himself not as the man above it all, but as someone standing behind glass, unable to touch what mattered. Back in the conference room, Evelyn gathered the papers one by one, aligning them neatly, restoring order where chaos had briefly entered. That was her way, quietly repairing what others broke. As she left the room, her heels made soft, measured sounds along the marble floor. The sound of composure, the sound of someone who refused to let the world see her bruise. Outside, the storm clouds had moved east, leaving the sky washed and pale. The light poured through the glass again, softer this time, almost gentle, as if apologizing for earlier. Evelyn paused by the window before heading back to her desk. She looked out at the river, calm and patient, and thought, maybe storms aren't meant to destroy. Maybe they just remind us what we're strong enough to survive. And with that quiet thought, she returned to her work, unseen yet unbroken, a silent force holding the fragile world of glass together. One breath, one small act of grace at a time. After the storm passed, the days at Caldwell Designs returned to their usual rhythm, predictable, precise, and quietly exhausting. Evelyn moved through them as she always had, steady as a heartbeat, carrying the invisible weight of keeping everything together. Yet something inside her had shifted. It was subtle, like a faint crack in the glass that no one else could see but that she felt every time she breathed. James had not spoken to her since that morning in the conference room. He had continued to move through the building like a shadow of authority present, commanding, but unreachable. The memory of his cold tone still lingered somewhere deep within her, not as anger, but as confirmation of what she had long known. She existed only in the spaces between other people's needs. And then, one Monday morning, the air in the office changed. It began with laughter, an unfamiliar sound in the polished corridors of Caldwell Designs. Not the careful, restrained kind of laughter that belonged to boardrooms, but something lighter, easier, alive. People lifted their heads from their screens. The receptionist straightened in her chair. Conversations sparked like tiny flames. The reason soon became clear. Luke Bennett had arrived. He was the new director of development, brought in from San Francisco, a man known for turning ideas into living things, for blending art and architecture with the kind of vision that made people feel rather than simply admire. Where James Caldwell was precise, Luke was spontaneous. Where James measured every word, Luke spoke like someone who trusted silence to hold him up when he was done. His presence warmed the air around him. He had that rare gift of making people feel lighter just by looking at them. On his first day, he didn't retreat into his office. He walked through the open floor, stopping at every desk, introducing himself with a smile that reached his eyes. He noticed people their names, their small decorations, the photos taped to their monitors. He asked questions and actually waited for the answers. When he reached Evelyn's corner, she was busy sorting through a set of reports, her focus deep as always. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle but confident. "You must be Evelyn Hart." She looked up, surprised that he already knew her name. "Yes," she said softly, almost apologetically. He smiled. "I've heard about you. You're the one who keeps this place running, aren't you?" For a moment, Evelyn didn't know how to respond. Compliments were rare currency in her world, and she had forgotten the language to spend them. She gave a small, polite smile. "I just do my part." Luke nodded, still holding her gaze, not out of curiosity, but recognition, the simple act of seeing someone and letting them know it. "Well," he said, "the place runs beautifully. That tells me a lot about you." When he walked away, Evelyn found herself watching the space he'd left behind, the faint echo of warmth he had carried with him. It wasn't romantic, not yet, not even close. It was human, and for someone who had spent years invisible, that alone felt like a miracle. Around her, the office began to shift in small ways. Luke's presence seemed to loosen the air. People laughed more freely. Meetings ran longer, but felt lighter. Even the cold glass walls seemed to reflect a gentler kind of light. James noticed, though he would never admit it. From his corner office, he could hear the hum of new energy rising through the building. He watched as Luke moved among the staff, engaging, listening, inspiring, and felt something stir in him that was neither admiration nor ease. Change had entered his world, and it wore a smile. Evelyn, meanwhile, found herself at the intersection of two worlds, the old one of quiet survival, and this new one of possibility. Luke would stop by her desk now and then, asking for input, sharing drafts, inviting her thoughts. He had a way of making collaboration feel like trust. Sometimes, while explaining a new concept, he'd gesture with his hands, painting invisible shapes in the air. And Evelyn, who had long believed her words carried no weight, found herself speaking up softly at first, then with growing confidence. It wasn't that she had changed overnight. It was simply that someone had turned toward her, and light has a way of transforming everything it touches. James walked past her one afternoon and saw her smiling an unguarded, genuine smile he had never seen before. She was standing beside Luke, their heads bent over a sketch, laughter in their voices. He slowed his step for just a moment, his eyes catching the scene through the glass. Something unfamiliar twisted inside him. He didn't stop. He didn't speak. He simply walked on, his reflection chasing him down the polished hallways. Evelyn returned to her desk later that day and caught her reflection in the window. For the first time in years, she didn't look away. There was color in her face, light in her eyes. It wasn't about Luke, not really. It was about what recognition does to the soul. To be seen, even briefly, was to be reminded that you still existed in the hearts of others, that invisibility was never the same as absence. That evening, as she packed her things, she paused for a moment, looking around the office. The glass walls still gleamed, the order still held, but somewhere within them, a quiet shift had begun. And though she didn't know it yet, that small moment of being truly seen would ripple far beyond her own heart, through James, through the company, through the very walls that had once kept them all so carefully apart. Outside, the last light of day reflected on the building's surface, turning the glass to gold. Evelyn stepped out into the cool Portland air, her steps light, her spirit steady. For the first time in a long while, she felt that perhaps the world wasn't blind after all. It had simply been waiting for someone to open their eyes. The next morning arrived quiet and golden, the kind of morning that slipped gently into being rather than announced itself. Sunlight touched the glass walls of Caldwell Designs, turning them into sheets of amber. Inside, the building hummed awake, printers warming, keyboards tapping, voices rising and falling like a familiar melody. Evelyn came in early, as she often did. There was comfort in being first, the calm before the noise, the stillness that belonged only to her. She placed her purse on the chair, hung her coat neatly, and began to ready her desk for another ordinary day. But that morning, something waited for her. Sitting right in the center of her desk was a small bouquet of yellow tulips, their petals still dewy from the early air. They weren't extravagant, just a handful, carefully arranged, wrapped in simple brown paper. A small white card rested against the stems. Her hands hesitated before picking it up. The handwriting was neat, easy to read. "Thank you for yesterday. You made my first day easy. Luke, for a moment." Evelyn simply stood there, the words sinking in. Tulips, of all flowers. He had chosen tulips bright, unpretentious, quietly alive. She had read somewhere that tulips meant sunshine after winter, and perhaps that was exactly what this was. The office had not yet filled, but soon footsteps began to echo down the hall, the murmur of voices growing. One by one, her co-workers arrived, and then the whispers began. "Oh, who sent those? Are they from him?" Evelyn got flowers. Their curiosity wasn't cruel, just startled. No one had ever thought of Evelyn as someone who received things, compliments, attention, gestures of affection, for years. She had been the one who gave quietly, never the one who was noticed. Her cheeks warmed slightly, though she said nothing. She only smiled softly, fingers brushing the petals as if unsure they were meant for her. By mid-morning, the bouquet had become the silent centerpiece of the entire floor. People passed her desk slower than usual, pretending to check the copier or fetch a file, but their eyes lingered on the yellow bloom. And then, the air shifted. James Caldwell stepped out of his office. He carried that same quiet authority that made the room realign itself around him. Conversations died mid-sentence. The space straightened under his presence. He was reviewing a file as he walked, but his gaze flicked up for the briefest moment and stopped. It was only a second, but the sight of those tulips on Evelyn's desk froze him. The yellow against the neutral gray of the office was almost too vivid, too alive. His eyes moved to Evelyn. She was standing by her chair, adjusting the vase slightly, her movements gentle, unaware that she had become a mirror for something inside him he did not want to see. Something twisted low in his chest, a strange, unwanted twinge. He had never thought of Evelyn as someone who could draw attention, and yet there she was, surrounded by color, by warmth, by light that wasn't supposed to belong in his world of polished control. His voice broke the silence. "Miss Hart," he said, his tone even but clipped. "When you're done admiring the decor, the proposal awaits." The words landed like small shards of glass. A few heads turned, then quickly looked away. Evelyn straightened. "Of course. Mr. Caldwell," she said softly. James turned and walked back toward his office, the echo of his footsteps tight, deliberate. When he reached the door, he paused just long enough for his reflection to catch in the glass panel beside him. In that reflection, behind his own image, the tulips glowed like a defiance of color in a world he had painted in shades of gray. For reasons he couldn't explain, he looked again. His eyes hardened, then softened, then looked away completely. Inside his office, he closed the door a little too firmly, as if to shut out whatever he had felt. He sat behind his desk, staring at the same line in the report for several minutes, unable to read it. Outside, life went on. Evelyn continued with her work, calm and steady, as if the small storm in the air had already passed. But something quiet lingered, a warmth that refused to fade. Each time she glanced at the tulips, she felt something new stirring in her, a simple gratitude, not just for the flowers, but for being seen, for being thought of. They weren't grand or romantic. They were gentle, human, and in a world built of glass and formality, that gentleness was a kind of rebellion. As the afternoon light shifted across the floor, the tulips seemed to follow it, petals opening wider, catching the sun. Evelyn smiled once, barely a whisper of a smile, and returned to her work. James, from his office, looked out through the glass once more. The reflection was there again. Evelyn's desk, the flowers, the faint golden hue that filled the space around her. And for the first time in a very long while, the man who prided himself on predictability found himself wondering why a few yellow tulips could make the world feel unsteady. Outside, the day moved gently toward evening. Evelyn stayed late, tidying her desk before leaving. She touched the petals once more, feeling their smooth, cool texture beneath her fingertips. They would fade soon, she knew. All flowers did. But for now, they were a quiet reminder that life had noticed her, and that maybe, just maybe, someone else had too. When she left, the lights dimmed behind her. In the reflection of the empty glass, the tulips still glowed faintly in the dusk, like small suns burning softly in the world of glass. By the time the tulips began to fade, something else had started to bloom, something quieter, harder to name. Evelyn had placed the flowers on the far corner of her desk, so the sunlight could reach them. Each morning, she trimmed their stems, refreshed their water, and smiled at their stubbornness. Even as the petals thinned and paled, they held on, like they, too, wanted to stay in her world just a little longer. Luke would sometimes stop by, leaning casually against her desk, talking about a new client or a creative project he was excited about. His words were easy, his laughter unguarded. He treated her as an equal someone worth hearing, not just listening to. Around them, the office seemed to hum differently now. There was warmth where there had once been only efficiency. But warmth, as the world often reminds us, has a way of unsettling those who have built their lives on control. And no one felt that unease more than James Caldwell. He first noticed it during a morning meeting. The conference room gleamed as always, polished and perfect. But his mind wasn't. He kept losing his place mid-sentence, his thoughts trailing off in the middle of projections. Every time he tried to focus, his eyes drifted to the glass wall that looked out onto the open floor. From where he sat, he could see Evelyn's desk. He didn't mean to look, not really, but his gaze went there anyway, almost against his will. She was talking with Luke, her expression calm, her hands folded neatly on the desk as she listened. Every now and then, she would laugh softly, just enough to touch the air. James turned his attention back to the meeting, but the sound lingered in his mind like a melody he couldn't quite forget. Later that afternoon, he caught himself again, his eyes finding her in the reflection of his office window. Luke was there beside her, showing her something on a tablet. They stood close, comfortable in a way that felt unfamiliar. A strange heaviness settled in his chest. He told himself it was irritation, nothing more. It wasn't. He tried to reason with it, as he did with everything else. Why should it matter Evelyn was a capable employee? Nothing more. Luke was a new director, friendly by nature. There was no reason at all for him to feel anything about it, and yet he did. He found himself growing impatient in meetings, distracted by thoughts that didn't belong to his orderly mind. His pen tapped against the table more often. His tone, once measured, grew sharper. When he spoke, his words came out colder, though he couldn't have said why. The first crack had appeared, thin and quiet, but undeniable. That afternoon, he crossed the open floor to review a project draft. Luke and Evelyn were already there, discussing a layout. Luke was pointing to something on the screen, his voice animated, his tone light. Evelyn listened intently, nodding in that gentle way she did when she understood more than she said. James stopped beside them. "Is this the presentation for the Martin account?" Luke turned, smiling easily. "Yes, we were just reviewing the design flow before finalizing it." "I see." James's gaze flicked briefly toward Evelyn, then to the screen. "Be sure to keep the visuals consistent with our existing portfolio. We're not running an art gallery." Luke's smile didn't falter. "Of course," he said smoothly. "But a little art never hurt the architecture." Evelyn looked between them, sensing the tension two different worlds meeting at the edge of civility. James nodded curtly. "Just make sure it's done by Friday." His tone was professional, but the air around his words was colder than before. As he walked away, his reflection followed him across the glass panels, tall, composed, and yet fractured by the lines of light that cut through the hallway. He didn't recognize that version of himself anymore. Back at his desk, he opened a report but didn't read it. His eyes caught the faint reflection again. Evelyn at her desk, Luke leaning closer, something easy and unforced in their exchange. James's jaw tightened. He thought of the flowers. He remembered the way they looked on her desk, bright and out of place in this sterile world. And he remembered the way her face had softened when she looked at them, as if for once the world had turned toward her instead of away. He told himself it meant nothing, that it should mean nothing. And yet, in the quiet of his office, the truth pressed against him like a whisper he didn't want to hear. He was jealous, not of Luke's charm or his ease, but of something far simpler, the way Luke could see her, the way he himself never had. From the corner of his eye, he saw Evelyn laugh again, that same quiet laugh that had followed him since the meeting. It unsettled him not because it was loud, but because it was honest. He had forgotten how honesty sounded. When she passed his office later, he called her in. His voice was steady, too steady. "Miss Hart," he said, not looking up from his screen, "I need the revised proposal on my desk before noon tomorrow." "Yes, Mr. Caldwell," she replied. Her tone was calm, polite. She stood for a moment, as if waiting for him to say something more. He didn't. As she turned to leave, he looked up briefly. Their eyes met through the reflection in the glass, hers gentle, his unreadable. When the door closed behind her, he exhaled slowly, as though the air itself had become too heavy to hold. The building around him remained flawless, every surface smooth, every reflection perfect. But deep inside, the man who built his life on order could feel it, a thin, invisible crack running through the glass. And though he didn't yet understand it, that crack was not the beginning of breaking, it was the beginning of seeing. The crack in James's composure didn't shatter. It spread quietly, like a ripple beneath still water. Days passed, then weeks. The company thrived, deadlines were met, and everything on paper looked perfect. But beneath the hum of routine, something intangible had shifted. Caldwell Designs, once a temple of order and silence, began to breathe differently. The laughter that Luke Bennett carried with him had found roots. People spoke more freely now. Small jokes passed between desks. Even the air felt lighter, less suffocating under the weight of professionalism. And at the center of that change, almost without realizing it, was Evelyn Hart. She smiled more often now, not the polite, practice smile she used to wear like armor, but something softer, genuine, almost radiant. Her laughter quiet, melodic, had a way of easing the tension in the room. People who once overlooked her now sought her advice, her calmness, her steady reassurance. She had become the quiet pulse of something new: kindness, perhaps, or connection. Luke, ever the spark, encouraged it. He would stop by her desk, leaning slightly against the divider, chatting about a project or some small wonder he'd seen on his way to work. Sometimes he brought her a coffee. Once, he handed her a sketch of a bridge and said, "I think beauty hides in the things that hold everything up." Evelyn smiled, understanding more than he knew. But for James Caldwell, each moment of warmth around her felt like a tremor beneath the foundation he had spent years building. He noticed the way people gravitated toward her now. He saw how even silence seemed softer when she was in the room. And every time she laughed with Luke, something deep within him tightened a feeling he could neither name nor dismiss. He told himself it was distraction, that he valued professionalism, not personal connection, that what bothered him was not her, but the erosion of control. But the truth lingered just beneath those excuses. Quiet and persistent, he missed being the one she looked toward, even if she never had. One afternoon, as he walked the corridor, a sound stopped him mid-step. It was her laughter, gentle, bright, unrestrained. He turned his head slightly. Through the glass wall, he saw Evelyn and Luke standing side by side at her desk. Luke was holding a stack of plans, telling a story animatedly. Evelyn's hand covered her mouth as she laughed, her eyes warm with light. James froze. For a long moment, he simply watched. He didn't move, didn't speak. The sight was almost unbearable in its simplicity. Two people sharing something human in a place built to be flawless. He could have walked in, could have joined the conversation, broken the moment, asserted the control that used to define him. But he didn't. Instead, he stood there quietly, his reflection overlapping theirs in the glass, a man divided by the barrier he had built himself. When he finally turned away, something in him felt hollowed out, as if the walls of his world had begun to echo. That night, his penthouse was silent except for the soft hum of the city below. The view stretched endlessly, bridges glowing across the Willamette, cars tracing thin lines of light. It was the kind of view that should have made him feel powerful, accomplished. Instead, it made him feel small. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the faint city light. The first sip burned, then dulled. He sat at his desk, the one facing the skyline, and opened his laptop. The email window glowed pale against the dark room. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he even knew what he meant to write. "Do you think of me when you smile like that?" The words appeared, fragile and uninvited. They startled him, too intimate, too raw for a man who prided himself on restraint. He stared at them for a long moment, the cursor blinking at the end of the sentence like a heartbeat he didn't want to admit was his own. Then, slowly, he pressed delete, one line at a time. The words disappeared, leaving the screen blank again. He closed the laptop, leaned back, and let the silence fill the room once more. Outside, rain had begun to fall again, gentle against the glass. James watched the drops slide down the window, tiny rivers tracing their own paths, never asking permission. He wondered when he had stopped noticing things like that. Maybe it was somewhere between ambition and loneliness, between building walls and forgetting why they were there. He thought of Evelyn, of the calm in her voice, the quiet courage she carried like second nature. He thought of Luke, too, and how easily warmth came to him, how freely he offered what James could never say. And for the first time in years, the truth came to him without resistance, soft but sharp in its honesty. "Maybe I've forgotten how to see people." The words lingered in his mind long after he turned off the lights. Outside, the city kept moving, the river flowing steady, the bridges holding strong, and somewhere below, in a quiet apartment near the water, Evelyn was probably asleep, unaware of the small ripple she had left in the heart of the man who had once believed he was made entirely of glass. The days that followed were strangely heavy, as if the air inside Caldwell Designs carried a quiet pressure that no one could name. James moved through his routines with the same precision as before. Yet something in him had changed. His thoughts no longer obeyed him. They drifted toward Evelyn without invitation. Each time he saw her talking with Luke, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest, a mix of pride and something dangerously close to envy. And Evelyn, she carried herself differently now, not louder, not bolder, but steadier. There was a quiet self-assurance in her that hadn't been there before, as though she had finally remembered her own worth after years of forgetting it. The shift was subtle, but in a building made of glass, even the smallest tremor could be felt everywhere. That tremor came to a head one Friday morning, the day of the investor meeting. It was one of those crisp Portland mornings where the sky was too clear to trust, sunlight bouncing off the building in sharp, silver shards. The conference room on the top floor gleamed brighter than usual, filled with the low hum of anticipation. Charts lined the screen, graphs projected across the walls. Evelyn sat near the end of the table, quietly reviewing the figures James had prepared the night before. She had gone through the numbers twice already, out of habit, and that's when she saw it, a small error, hidden deep within the cost projection. A single decimal misplaced, 1 zero too many, a small mistake, but one that could cost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. She hesitated. Her heart thudded once, hard, against her ribs. Then she lifted her hand. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice calm but clear. "I believe there's an inconsistency in the third quarter estimate." The room fell silent, heads turned. James looked up from his notes, his jaw tightening. What inconsistency? Evelyn met his gaze steady, unflinching. "Here," she said, pointing to the line on the chart. The projected cost for materials was entered as $1.2 million. It should be $120,000. The words hung in the air, simple and irrefutable. For a moment, James said nothing. Then his tone sharpened. "Are you suggesting," he asked slowly, "that I made a mistake?" Evelyn's hand stayed still on the table. "I'm suggesting that there's an error," she replied softly. He felt the heat rise under his collar. He knew she was right even before he checked the numbers himself. But pride, that quiet tyrant that had ruled him for years, refused to yield. "Perhaps if certain departments had double-checked their work," he said, his voice slicing through the room, "this wouldn't have been brought up in front of our investors." The comment landed heavy. It wasn't just defensive, it was cruel. Evelyn blinked once, her expression unreadable. Around the table, a few people looked away. Luke's eyes darkened. "James," Luke said evenly, his tone controlled but firm, "she's trying to protect you and the company. That's what good people do." The room went still. The use of his first name, the quiet challenge in it, was something no one had ever dared before. James turned sharply toward him. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett," he said, each syllable clipped. "But I can speak for myself." Luke didn't back down. "Then speak truthfully," he said, because the only person who caught the problem was her. Silence, the kind that presses against the chest until it hurts to breathe. Evelyn looked between the two men, one rigid with pride, the other open with conviction, and something inside her settled. She stood, slowly, calmly. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried through the room like a bell. "If accuracy offends you, Mr. Caldwell," she said, "maybe truth does too." The room froze. Even the projector's hum seemed to fade. For the first time in years, James had no words. He simply stared at her, the woman he had once overlooked, the one who had made herself small for the sake of peace. Now she stood taller than anyone in the room, not because of defiance, but because of dignity. Evelyn gathered her notes, her movements graceful, deliberate. Then she walked toward the door. Each step echoed softly against the polished floor, the sound of boundaries being redrawn. When she reached the doorway, she paused. "I'll have the corrected report sent by noon," she said quietly. "Good morning," and with that, she left. Every head in the room turned toward James. The man who was never questioned, never challenged, now stood alone in the spotlight of his own silence. Luke exhaled, leaned back, and looked at him, not with victory, but with disappointment. "She deserves better," he said softly, then gathered his papers and followed her out. James remained there, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Outside, the reflection of the city wavered against the glass walls. His reflection, too, was there, fractured, distorted, and somehow smaller than before. He had built a world of mirrors to control how everything looked. But, for the first time, he was forced to see what lay beneath the reflection: his own loneliness, his fear of imperfection, his blindness to the people who kept his empire standing. The meeting resumed without him. He couldn't have spoken if he tried. He turned toward the window, the city glowing under the clear morning sun. Somewhere down there, Evelyn was walking head held high, quiet but unbroken. And though he didn't yet realize it, that moment, the one where she finally walked away, would be the beginning of his reckoning. Because sometimes it takes losing the one person who saw you clearly to finally start learning how to see yourself. The rest of the day unfolded in uneasy silence. After Evelyn's words had cut through the air like glass, no one dared mention the incident. People moved quietly around the office, whispering only when the doors were closed. The story had already traveled across departments how Evelyn Hart had stood up to James Caldwell, the man no one ever contradicted. By sunset, the building had emptied. The golden light of evening filtered through the glass walls, painting everything in soft amber. Most employees had gone home, but Evelyn stayed late, finishing the revised report she had promised. Her fingers moved methodically over the keyboard, her expression calm. Yet beneath that calm was the tremor of exhaustion, not from the work itself, but from the cost of finally speaking her truth. She printed the documents, stacked them neatly, and carried them upstairs to James's office. The hallway was quiet. Her heels echoed softly against the polished floor. The door to his office was half closed, the lights inside dim. She knocked gently. "Come in." His voice said low, restrained. Evelyn stepped inside, placing the file on his desk. "The corrected report," she said simply. James looked up. His face was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed the storm he'd been carrying all day. "Close the door, Miss Hart." She hesitated just for a heartbeat, then did as he asked. The soft click of the door seemed to seal the two of them in a world apart from everything else. For a long moment, neither spoke. The hum of the city below filled the silence: cars, faint sirens, the whisper of distant rain. Finally, James broke the stillness. "You embarrass me today." Evelyn blinked once, steady but calm. "I corrected an error." His jaw tightened. "In front of investors, in front of my team. I didn't plan to do it publicly," she said. "But you asked for the numbers, and I told the truth." James stood, pacing a few steps behind his desk, his voice sharp with a frustration he could barely contain. "There's a difference between honesty and insubordination." Her expression softened, not in submission, but in quiet disbelief. "Is that what you think it was, I think?" he said, turning toward her. "You've forgotten your place." Something flickered across her face. Sadness, not anger. She took a slow breath. "My place," she repeated softly. "I know it very well. Mr. Caldwell. It's the quiet corner near the copy machine. It's the desk no one sees unless they need something. It's where I've been for years, keeping your company running, while you walked past me like I wasn't there." He stared at her, words failing him. "You talk about professionalism," she continued, her voice even but weighted with truth. "But what you mean is obedience. You mistake silence for respect and invisibility for loyalty." James turned away, his hands braced on the desk. "That's not fair." "No," she said gently. "It isn't, but it's true." Her words hung between them, fragile and final. He turned back to face her, his anger flickering into something else: confusion, guilt, maybe even sorrow. "You think I never saw you," he said quietly, almost to himself. Evelyn met his eyes. "You didn't." The silence deepened. "You never saw me." "James," she said, her voice trembling now, not with fear, but with honesty long withheld. "You saw a function, not a person. You saw what I could fix for you, what I could make right, what I could keep from falling apart. But you never saw me." He took a step closer, but she didn't move. There was nothing left to explain. The truth was already between them, raw and real and undeniable. For years, she had lived in the shadow of his brilliance, keeping the chaos at bay. For years, he had believed that control was the same as care. Now, in this quiet office where everything gleamed but nothing felt alive, both of them finally saw what they had become: a man trapped behind glass, and a woman who had finally found the courage to walk beyond it. James's voice broke the silence again, softer now. "Evelyn, I didn't mean—" She shook her head gently. "I know you didn't. That's the problem." He looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her. The faint light caught the lines of her face, the calm strength in her posture, the unspoken exhaustion in her eyes. And something inside him cracked. The last defense of a man who had built his life on being unbreakable. But Evelyn had no anger left, only clarity. "I'm not angry, James," she said quietly. "Just done pretending that being invisible is enough." She turned toward the door. He took a small step forward, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Evelyn." She paused but didn't turn back. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. "You have a beautiful world here. Try to see it before it's gone." And with that, she walked out. The door closed behind her with a quiet finality that felt louder than any argument. James stood alone in the fading light. The office, once his fortress, now felt like a hollow shell. The glow from the city below flickered against the glass walls, painting him in fragments half light, half shadow. He looked down at the desk where her report still lay, the edges perfectly aligned. Her handwriting marked the margins small, careful notes that spoke of the woman who had once held his world together. The building's lights began to dim automatically, one floor at a time. Soon, the only illumination came from the city outside, soft, distant, and unreachable. James stayed there long after the office had gone dark, his reflection the only company he had left. And for the first time in years, he didn't see a leader or a man in control. He saw someone lost behind the glass of his own, making watching the world move on without him. The night after Evelyn walked out of his office, the building felt impossibly quiet. James stayed long after the cleaning crew had gone, the only light left spilling from his office window. The city outside was a blur of motion headlights tracing ribbons of gold along the river, neon signs flickering in the distance. Everything moved on without him, as though the world no longer needed his permission to exist. He sat in his chair, staring at the door she had closed behind her. He half expected it to open again. It didn't. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, exhaustion overtook him. When he finally left the office, the elevator ride down felt endless. The glass walls that once filled him with pride now only reflected his own solitude. He drove home through empty streets, the radio off, the silence heavy enough to echo. The next morning, the sun rose as it always did, indifferent to human hearts. James arrived early, as was his habit. The building greeted him with its usual precision-polished floors, soft lighting, the faint hum of efficiency. But something was off. He couldn't name it right away, only that the air felt thinner, as if something essential had gone missing overnight. Then he saw it, Evelyn's desk, empty. The small plant she had tended was gone. The pen holder, the framed photograph of a distant landscape he'd never asked about. Even the tulip vase long dried and forgotten had disappeared. The space looked clean, almost sterile, like a place that had never been lived in. For years, her desk had been the quiet anchor of the office. Now, without her, it looked like a pause that would never end. A white envelope sat in the center of the desk, his name written neatly across the front. He picked it up, his chest tightening before he even broke the seal. Inside, The note was short. "Thank you for the opportunity. I wish you well. Evelyn Hart." That was all. No anger, no explanation. Just the kind of grace that leaves no trace but still breaks you. James stood there for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. The noise of the office seemed distant now, the phones, the chatter, the hum of computers. It all blurred into a background he couldn't feel part of anymore. He went back to his office, closed the door, and sank into his chair. The note lay on the desk before him, a quiet punctuation mark to a story he hadn't realized was ending. He reached for his phone. Her number was still in his contacts, of course it was. He hesitated, then pressed call. The line rang once, twice, then a voice message. "This number is no longer in service." He listened to the words twice, just to be sure, then set the phone down gently, as if any sudden movement might make the silence worse. The hours passed, but he couldn't bring himself to work. Every corner of the office reminded him of her, how she used to straighten the meeting agendas before he arrived, how she'd refill the coffee pot before anyone else noticed it was empty, how her calm presence had been the invisible rhythm that made everything run. He had never thanked her for any of it. He wasn't sure he even knew how. Now, all that remained was the echo of what she had kept together, an empire of glass, immaculate on the outside, hollow within. He turned his chair toward the window. The city sprawled beneath him, vast and glittering. From here, it all looked perfect, his creation, his legacy. But for the first time, he didn't feel proud. He felt blind. He spoke quietly, almost as if afraid the truth would sound too loud in the emptiness. "I built walls of glass to keep people in sight." He paused, the weight of the words sinking into him, and ended up blind. The sentence hung in the still air, fragile and final. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. For years, he had believed that seeing everything, the data, the reports, the outcomes, was enough. But vision without empathy was its own kind of darkness. Outside, the day carried on as if nothing had changed. The staff moved about their routines. Emails were sent, meetings began, but the rhythm was off, like a song missing its melody. Everyone felt it, though no one said it aloud. Luke passed by Evelyn's empty desk and stopped. He stared at the bare surface, then at the small indentation where her coffee mug used to sit. His jaw tightened. He looked up toward James's office, the glass reflecting sunlight like fire. Inside, James sat alone, the letter still on his desk. He had read it again and again, as if repetition could rewrite it, as if meaning might appear between the lines. But all it gave him was silence. He turned the note over, hoping for more words on the back. There were none. For a man who lived by precision, by numbers and logic, it was a strange kind of pain to be undone by something so small, so human, so final. That evening, as the office emptied once more, James remained. The city lights flickered to life, glowing softly through the walls of glass. He walked toward the window, placing a hand against the cool surface. From here, he could see the Willamette River, winding steady and sure, the same river Evelyn's apartment overlooked. Somewhere out there, she was beginning a new day without him, free, unseen, but perhaps at peace. He exhaled, the fog of his breath briefly clouding his reflection. For an instant, he didn't see the polished executive or the master of glass towers. He saw a man who had everything except connection, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt something real regret, not sharp, but heavy and slow, like rain finally reaching the ground after years of drought. He whispered her name once, just to hear it in the quiet. Then, with a long, unsteady breath, he turned off the lights and stepped out into the night, carrying nothing but the echo of what he had finally learned to see. Time didn't stop after Evelyn left it, simply lost its rhythm. Days bled into one another, each one quieter than the last. The building of glass still stood as proud and gleaming as ever, but something vital inside it had dimmed. Caldwell Designs, once a symphony of precision, now sounded slightly out of tune. At first, it was small things, an unanswered email here, a missed call there, But soon, cracks began to appear where Evelyn's quiet diligence had once held everything together. Reports came in late, meetings overlapped, clients grew impatient. Without her unseen hand guiding the chaos, the company began to stumble. What had once run like clockwork now faltered under its own weight. James noticed it immediately, though he told himself it was temporary. He told himself that every company had transitions, that order would return in time. But each day proved him wrong. It wasn't just the missing work, it was the missing calm. Evelyn had never been the loudest or the most visible, but she had been the still point around which everything turned, the quiet gravity that kept the world from spinning apart. Without her, everything seemed to drift, and James drifted most of all. He arrived later each morning and left earlier each evening. His suits remained impeccable, his tone measured, but the spark was gone. The sharpness in his eyes had dulled into something weary, unfocused. There were moments when he would catch himself looking toward her empty desk, forgetting, for a split second, that she was no longer there. Once, he even began to call out her name during a meeting, asking for a file only she would have known how to find. The room fell silent before he realized his mistake. He stopped speaking mid-sentence and dismissed everyone. That night, he stayed late again, papers piled on his desk, emails unopened. The city lights shimmered outside the window, reflecting back at him like questions he couldn't answer. For years, he had believed that success meant control, that if everything looked perfect, then it must be perfect. But perfection had a cost. It demanded silence from everyone who helped build it. Now, in the silence Evelyn left behind, he finally heard what he'd ignored for years, the sound of his own loneliness. One afternoon, unable to focus, James left the office early. He drove aimlessly through Portland's streets, the kind of slow, wandering drive that people take when they're looking for something they can't name. Rain streaked across the windshield. He turned down a familiar street without thinking, the one lined with old brick shops and hanging flower baskets. And then he saw it, the small cafe on the corner. He hadn't meant to end up there, but his heart recognized it before his mind did. It was the cafe Evelyn used to mention in passing, the one near the river where she sometimes went before work. He parked across the street and sat there for a moment, engine off. Through the glass window, he could see the faint warmth of light inside, people talking, coffee steaming, the rhythm of life carrying on. But at the small table by the window, the one she used to sit at, there was only an empty chair. He imagined her there, coffee in hand, eyes distant but peaceful, watching the river move as if it carried her thoughts away. The image came so vividly that, for a second, he almost believed he could open the door and find her sitting there still. He didn't go in. He couldn't. Instead, he watched the rain slide down the glass, distorting the reflection of that empty chair. It felt like looking at a memory, something both close and unreachable. That night, the rain followed him home. The city's noise faded into the distance as he sat alone in his apartment, a half-empty glass of wine beside him. The skyline outside looked cold, detached, as if the same walls of glass that had once made him powerful now only reminded him how separate he'd become. He walked to the window, resting his hand against it. The coolness bit at his skin. His reflection stared back, sharp suit, tired eyes, the faintest tremor in his jaw. The kind of man who had everything except the ability to hold on to what mattered. He thought of Evelyn's final words, the way she had looked at him, not with anger, but with understanding, the kind of understanding that felt like mercy. He whispered into the quiet room, voice barely audible. How did I lose someone I never had the courage to see? The sound of it startled him, not the words themselves, but how true they felt. For years, he had lived behind glass walls, walls that gave him visibility, but no vision. He had seen everything, yet noticed nothing. And the one person who had been there all along, the one who had made his world function in silence, had slipped away the moment he finally began to look. The rain grew heavier outside, tapping against the window like a steady heartbeat. James stayed there a long time, watching the droplets merge and fall, watching the city blur. Somewhere in that blur, he felt something stir, not hope exactly, but the faint ache of realization, Perhaps this was what seeing really meant, not control, not ownership, but the willingness to face what's been lost and the courage to learn from it. He turned away from the window, leaving the lights off. The city glowed dimly behind him, soft and forgiving. For the first time in a long while, James didn't reach for a report or a plan. He simply let the silence settle, because in the hollow space Evelyn had left behind, something new was quietly taking root, and understanding that sometimes loss isn't the end. It's the beginning of finally learning to see. Autumn came quietly to Portland. The leaves along the Willamette River turned shades of amber and rust, swirling in the wind like small reminders that everything, even the strongest trees, must learn to let go. For James Caldwell, the season felt like a mirror. Every morning he rose, dressed, and went to work as he always had. But the rhythm was hollow. The building still gleamed. The project still moved forward, but without Evelyn's unseen hand. Something essential was missing, something that numbers and deadlines could never replace. Weeks had passed since she left, but she was still everywhere, in the order she left behind, in the calm tone she'd used when things went wrong, in the faint trace of her handwriting on old reports he couldn't bring himself to throw away. And in his own silence, he had spoken countless words in his life, led meetings, closed deals, built an empire from ambition and discipline. Yet the words that truly mattered, he had never said until now. One evening, after another long day of pretending that everything was fine, James found himself sitting at his desk, the city's lights glowing faintly through the glass walls. The office was quiet, the way it often was after dark, the hum of machines replaced by the hum of thought. He stared at a blank sheet of paper for a long time. It wasn't a report or a proposal this time. It was something far more fragile, a letter. He hadn't written one by hand in years. His pen hovered above the page before the first words finally came. Evelyn. He paused. The name alone felt heavy, an invocation of everything he'd failed to see, everything he'd failed to say. Then slowly, with a trembling hand, he began. I don't know where to begin, so I'll start with the only thing that feels honest. I'm sorry. He stopped for a moment, staring at the ink as it spread slightly into the paper's fibers, as if even the page understood the weight of his confession. I spent years thinking that leadership meant distance, that if I could control everything, I would never have to lose anything. I built a world made of glass so I could see everyone, so nothing would surprise me. But what I didn't realize was that glass only shows you reflections. It never lets you touch what's real. The pen trembled again. His handwriting, once sharp and precise, had softened, almost uncertain. You were the quiet center of a noisy world. Evelyn. You held things together without asking for praise. I never thanked you for that. I never even looked closely enough to see how much of this company, how much of my life, was built on your quiet strength. He paused again, his eyes unfocused. Outside, the city glittered like a constellation of tiny lives, each light belonging to someone with their own story, their own regrets. Since you left, he wrote, I've come to understand what emptiness really is. It isn't the absence of people, it's the absence of meaning. Every morning, I walk into that office and see the space where you used to be, and I realize how much you filled without ever taking up room. He stopped, letting the silence settle around him like a confession in a church. Then, with a slow exhale, he continued, I don't know where you are. I don't know if you would even want to hear from me, but I needed to write this, not to ask for forgiveness, but to say that I finally see you, not the employee, not the function, but the person. The next line came softer, as though it had been waiting years to be said. You once told me that I saw the world, but never people. You were right. I see that now. I see you. He set the pen down and read the letter through, his breath catching once or twice when he reached certain sentences. He didn't change them. He couldn't. For the first time, there was nothing to edit, nothing to perfect. It was raw, imperfect, but true. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into an envelope, and addressed it by hand. The only address he had was her old one, the small apartment near the river. He didn't know if she still lived there, or if she would even open something from him. Still, he wrote the words with care, sealing the envelope like one seals a memory gently. Knowing it may never return, on the back, he wrote a single line, the only sentence he had rewritten twice before settling on the simplest version. If this letter finds you, let it tell you, I finally see you. The next morning, he dropped it into a blue mailbox on his way to work. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching the envelope disappear through the narrow slot. It was a small act, almost insignificant, but for him, it felt monumental. For years, his power had been measured in contracts, signatures, and deals. Now, it was in the act of letting go. That evening, back in his office, James sat quietly with a cup of coffee, the sky fading into indigo. He didn't know if the letter would ever reach her, or if it even mattered. What mattered was that he had written it. That he had tried. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of his small act of courage. Inside, the man who had once lived behind glass walls felt the faintest crack of light begin to filter through. He looked toward the river, tracing its steady flow in the distance. Somewhere out there, Evelyn was living her own life, maybe still by that water, maybe far away. And though she might never read his words, he hoped that somehow, in some quiet way, she would know that she had been seen, that she had mattered, that she had changed him. James leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a long moment. The world was still heavy, but it no longer felt hollow. And for the first time in years, he wasn't looking at his reflection. He was looking beyond it. Winter faded into spring, almost imperceptibly at first, a slow thaw that began not in the air, but in the heart of a man who had finally learned how to feel again. It had been months since James sent the letter. He never received a reply. For a while, he checked the mail each morning, half hoping, half dreading an envelope with familiar handwriting, but none came. And in time, the waiting softened into something gentler, not acceptance. Exactly. But peace. The world outside his glass walls began to change, and somehow, he did too. Caldwell Designs was still the same building of light and reflection, but the atmosphere within it had shifted. The sharp edges of fear and formality were slowly worn down by something warmer, something that felt almost like grace. It began in small ways. One morning, a junior designer made a mistake on a proposal. Months ago, James would have reprimanded him sharply, letting precision speak louder than compassion. But that day, he simply walked over, sat beside the young man, and said quietly, "Let's look at it together." The designer stared at him in disbelief, then nodded. It was a small moment, but small moments are how great changes begin. Over the next several months, James began to undo the world he had once built so rigidly. He replaced performance reviews with conversations. He started weekly team lunches, where real laughter, returned to the hallways. He launched a new initiative focused on mental health and personal growth, encouraging his employees to take time off, to breathe, to live. At first, the staff didn't know what to make of it. Some were cautious, others were quietly hopeful. Luke, ever observant, watched James with a mixture of surprise and quiet respect. And Evelyn, though she was no longer there, seemed to linger in every choice he made. He often thought of what she might say if she could see the transformation, how she might smile that quiet, knowing smile of hers and say, "It's never too late to see differently." He never spoke her name aloud at work, but everyone sensed the shift. The man who once walked through the halls like a storm now moved like sunlight, still focused, still sharp, but touched with warmth. Even the building itself seemed to change. The glass walls, once symbols of distance, now reflected laughter, conversation, human connection. There were small plants on desks, personal photos pinned to corkboards. People stayed after hours not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And for the first time in years, James Caldwell didn't measure success in profit margins or projections. He measured it in smiles. One afternoon, during a team meeting, Luke leaned over to a colleague and whispered, almost in disbelief, "He's different now. Almost human." The words weren't meant to be heard, but James caught them anyway. Instead of irritation, he felt something unexpected, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Almost," he said, raising an eyebrow with a hint of humor. The room froze for a second, then broke into laughter. It was light, genuine, contagious. For James, it felt like a quiet victory not over others, but over himself. As spring deepened, the company began to flourish in new ways. Projects came alive with creativity. Clients noticed the change too, not just in the work, but in the spirit behind it. One evening, James stood by the large window in his office, watching the sun sink behind the river. The reflection on the glass was different now. He no longer saw just his own face looking back. He saw movement people talking, smiling, living. It struck him how strange it was that for years he had built his empire out of transparency, yet lived blind to everything that made it beautiful. Now, for the first time, he saw not the walls, but the lives inside them. He thought of Evelyn again, not with longing, but with gratitude. She had been the one to teach him the hardest truth that leadership was not about control, but connection. That people weren't pieces in a plan, but souls needing to be seen. Later that week, he held a staff meeting in the main atrium, an open, sunlit space filled with the hum of conversation. He began with something he'd never said before. "I want to thank all of you," he said simply. "Not for your work, but for your presence. This company doesn't stand because of buildings or designs, it stands because of people." There was a hush, then quiet applause. A few employees exchanged looks, smiling softly, and then, as the meeting ended, James noticed a small plant on the reception desk, a yellow tulip, its stem reaching toward the light. No one knew who had placed it there, but it caught his eye, and for a fleeting moment, he felt her presence in that gentle bloom. He reached out, touched the leaf lightly, and smiled a true, unguarded smile, the first in years. It was the kind of smile that didn't come from success or recognition, but from the relief of finally being whole. As evening settled, he lingered by the window again, the city alive below. The office lights glowed behind him, warm and steady. He thought of the man he had once been distant, brittle, afraid of failure, and then he thought of the man he was becoming, imperfect, perhaps, but awake. Somewhere deep inside, he whispered a silent thank you to Evelyn, because sometimes the people who walk away don't leave to hurt us. They leave so we can finally learn to become the kind of person who deserves to be seen. James turned off the lights and stepped out into the night air, the scent of spring rain rising from the streets. He felt lighter, quieter, more human than he had in a long time. And though he didn't know where life would lead next, he knew this much was true. Change doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes, it comes softly like sunlight through glass, warming the places we once thought would stay cold forever. Summer drifted into autumn again, marking almost a year since James had sent his letter. Life at Caldwell Designs had found a new rhythm, softer, slower, more human. The office still hummed with energy, but it was no longer driven by fear. People smiled when they passed each other in the halls. There was laughter in the break room. Even the late evenings no longer felt heavy with exhaustion, but touched with warmth. James had changed in quiet, unremarkable ways, the kind of changes that aren't visible in mirrors but live in the heart. He listened more. He asked questions. He remembered birthdays. When someone stumbled, he didn't correct. He helped. He no longer saw himself as the man behind the glass. He had become part of the world he once ruled from afar. But even as his days filled with new meaning, there was still one thread left, untied, one silence that lingered softly at the edge of every sunrise. Evelyn. He didn't expect to hear from her anymore. In time, he stopped checking his mail for handwriting. He recognized. He told himself her silence was an answer that perhaps she had read his letter, perhaps she hadn't. But either way, she was living her life. And that was enough. until one crisp October morning when an envelope appeared on his desk. No one knew who had placed it there. The handwriting was neat, familiar, steady, the kind of handwriting that once filled meeting notes and margins with quiet wisdom. His breath caught. He turned the envelope over. His name was written simply, James Caldwell. For a long moment, he just stared at it, afraid to open what might change everything again. Then, with slow hands, he broke the seal. Dear James, it's taken me some time to write this, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to say it with peace, not pain. I received your letter months ago. I read it once in silence, then again out loud, just to make sure I wasn't imagining the sincerity in your words. I kept it on my desk for weeks before I could bring myself to respond. James paused, the familiar ache rising in his chest. He could almost hear her voice through the words, calm, even deliberate. Life has changed for me in ways I never expected. The letter continued. After leaving Caldwell Designs, I took time to rest to remember who I was outside of responsibility. I realized how many women live their lives unseen, how many give without being acknowledged. I wanted to change that, even in small ways. So I joined an organization that helps women gain recognition in the workplace, teaching them how to be heard, how to believe that what they contribute matters. It's hard work, but it feels like home. For the first time, I'm not invisible, not even to myself. The words blurred slightly as his eyes welled. He blinked them clear and read on. I don't hold anger toward you. James, what happened between us wasn't cruelty. It was blindness, the kind that comes from fear, not from lack of heart. You lived in a world that rewarded distance. I don't blame you for building walls. I only wish you could have looked through them sooner. Your letter told me you finally did. That means more to me than you'll ever know. He stopped again, pressing his hand lightly over the paper. The air around him felt heavy with memory, her quiet presence in the office, the sound of her voice during late meetings, the calm that used to steady him without his realizing it. Her words continued. I hope you're doing well. I hope you found peace, and that you've learned to see the beauty and imperfection in people, in moments, even in yourself. I hear from Luke sometimes. He says the office feels different now. He says you laugh. I'm glad. And then, near the end, a single line written with careful tenderness. You once told me that buildings were predictable. Maybe they are, but people. James, people can surprise you. Thank you for your letter. Thank you for finally seeing me. And thank you for teaching me, in your own way, to see myself. With grace. Evelyn James read the letter once, then twice, then a third time, each reading slower than the last. He could feel the quiet forgiveness between every line, not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that transforms it into something softer, something that no longer hurts to touch. When he reached the final words again, I'm not invisible anymore. James, not even to myself. His vision blurred. He set the letter down carefully, his hand trembling, and leaned back in his chair. For a long time, he said nothing. The only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the city outside. A single tear rolled down his cheek light, unforced, honest. It wasn't grief anymore. It was gratitude. He looked out the window at the river glinting in the distance, the same river that had once mirrored her solitude. Now, it reflected the afternoon light in ripples, constant, changing, alive. He smiled, a small, quiet smile that carried the weight of both loss and peace. Sometimes, he thought, the greatest gifts don't come from those who stay. They come from those who leave, and in doing so, teach us how to be more human. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the top drawer of his desk, next to a single yellow tulip petal he had kept without knowing why. As evening fell, the glass walls of his office caught the last golden light of day. And for the first time in years, James felt something he hadn't known how to name until now, grace. A grace that didn't ask for anything. A grace that simply stayed. 5 years passed like the quiet turning of pages, not rushed, not loud, just steady. The city had changed. Portland had grown busier, brighter, more alive. But some things remained the same: the steady hum of the river, the soft mist on early mornings, and the way life sometimes circled back when one least expected it. For James Caldwell, time had done what reflection alone could not. It had softened the hard lines of ambition that once ruled his every thought. His company had flourished not because of expansion or profit, but because it had learned to breathe again. Caldwell Designs had become known not just for architecture, but for empathy, a place where people felt valued, where creativity came from trust, not fear. There were mentorship programs, flexible hours, wellness retreats. The culture he had once controlled like a machine now thrived like a garden, and that transformation had not gone unnoticed. So, when he received an invitation to a charity gala one autumn evening, an event honoring those who had redefined leadership with humanity, he accepted, though part of him hesitated. He had never liked the spotlight. Once, he might have relished it, but not now. He attended not for recognition, but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had become a better man. The gala was held at a restored concert hall overlooking the Willamette. Strings of warm light hung from the high ceilings, casting everything in a soft golden glow. Crystal glasses clinked, laughter floated, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and wine. James arrived alone, dressed in a simple black suit. His hair had grayed at the temples, and the once rigid set of his jaw had relaxed into something gentler. Time, it seemed, had taught him grace. He mingled politely, shaking hands, answering questions. People spoke of his company's programs, the scholarships he'd funded, the community spaces he'd helped design. But he found himself distracted not by pride, but by a faint restlessness, as if something unseen tugged quietly at the edges of his evening. Then, midway through the program, the host stepped onto the stage. "And now," she announced, "we are honored to present the Humanity in Leadership Award to a man whose vision transformed not only his company, but the lives within it. Please welcome James Caldwell." Applause filled the hall. James rose, surprised by the warmth of it. As he made his way to the stage, he caught glimpses of faces kind, curious, expectant. He stood at the podium, the lights gentle on his face, and for a moment, he simply looked out at the crowd. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "This isn't really about me. It's about people, the ones who taught me what leadership actually means. To see, to listen, to understand that behind every success story is a soul who made it possible." He paused, a faint smile crossing his face. "I used to think that building strong walls was the goal, but life has a way of teaching us that sometimes. It's about learning to let the light in." The audience was silent not out of formality, but because truth has a way of holding people still. He finished simply, "Thank you for seeing me, and thank you to the one who taught me how." There was applause again, generous, sincere, but even as he stepped off the stage, his heart was somewhere else. A familiar echo stirred within him, gentle as a memory. Then he saw her. She was standing near the back of the room, speaking with one of the event organizers. The years had touched her softly lines of experience around her eyes, silver glinting faintly in her hair, but her presence was unchanged, steady, bright. Evelyn Hart. He stopped walking. For a heartbeat. The room seemed to fade around them, the noise, the light, the hum of music. All that remained was recognition. She turned, sensing his gaze, and their eyes met across the room. The same calm that once unsettled him now grounded him. Evelyn smiled, small, genuine, unguarded. Then she crossed the space between them. "James," she said softly. "Evelyn." His voice carried a quiet reverence, like saying a name he'd once prayed with. For a moment, neither spoke. It wasn't awkward, it was full, like silence after a symphony. "You've changed," she said finally, her tone gentle, but knowing. He nodded. "You taught me to—" Her smile deepened, not prideful, not nostalgic, just kind. "I didn't teach you. I only reminded you who you could be." They stood there, two people shaped by time, by regret, by forgiveness. There was no need for apology anymore. They had already given each other what mattered most, understanding. "I read about your work," he said. "The foundation. You've built something beautiful." She glanced down modestly. "It's meaningful. Every woman I meet reminds me why I left and why I'm grateful I did. Sometimes walking away isn't about ending something. It's about beginning to live." James nodded, eyes soft. "I know that now." A pause, the kind that holds years within it. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The company. The old days." Evelyn looked up, meeting his gaze. "No," she said, not unkindly. "I miss certain people, perhaps, but not the feeling of being unseen." He absorbed that not as a wound, but as truth, a truth he could finally bear. The host called her name then, Ms. Evelyn Hart, from the Women's Leadership Alliance, will now present the final award of the evening. James smiled, stepping back as she moved toward the stage. The crowd applauded again, and as she passed him, their eyes met once more, not with longing, but with mutual peace. She took the microphone, her poise effortless, her voice calm and sure. "This award," she said, "is for those who believe that success is not measured by what we build, but by how we lift others. True leadership begins the moment we choose to see people fully, honestly, and with compassion." Her gaze found his briefly in the crowd. She didn't linger, but the meaning was clear, an echo of grace that needed no words. Later that night, as the gala ended and the guests filtered out into the cool Portland air, James and Evelyn met one last time by the entrance. "Congratulations," she said, her tone light. "Thank you," he replied. "You too." They stood under the golden glow of the streetlight. The wind carried the scent of rain. "Well," she said softly, "it was good to see you again." He nodded. "It was good to see you. Really see you." She smiled, touched his arm briefly, a simple, human gesture, and then walked toward the waiting car that would take her away. James watched her go, not with sorrow, but with quiet gratitude. Because some people don't return to stay. They return to remind you that healing happened for both of you. And as he turned back toward the city, the lights of Portland reflected in the windows around him. For the first time, he saw not his reflection, but the lives, the colors, the humanity shining through. And he smiled, content in knowing that sometimes the most beautiful endings aren't really endings at all, just circles that finally close in peace. The night air was cool when James stepped out of the gala. The city stretched before him, lights shimmering on wet pavement, laughter echoing faintly from passing streets. The hum of life felt different now, softer somehow, as if the whole world had exhaled after holding its breath. He stood for a moment under the streetlight, watching Evelyn's car disappear into the distance. The red taillights faded down the avenue until they were just pinpoints of memory. He didn't chase them with his eyes for long. Instead, he smiled, a quiet, honest smile, the kind that comes not from what you gain, but from what you finally understand. Inside the hall, music still played, voices mingled in celebration. He turned back toward the sound, toward the warmth of the crowd. For the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel separate from it. He wasn't the man behind the glass anymore. He was part of the world again. The next morning, Portland woke beneath a veil of mist. The city glowed pale and calm, bridges fading in and out of fog, the river running smooth and silver. James walked to the office early, coat collar turned up against the chill. Caldwell Design stood tall as ever, its glass walls catching the faint morning light. Once, those walls had symbolized perfection, cold, untouchable, a reflection of his ambition. Now, they felt like windows into something living. As he stepped inside, the familiar scent of coffee and paper greeted him. The office was slowly filling with people, voices low, laughter easy, the rhythm of a place that had found its heart again. He passed the reception desk, where a new assistant smiled at him warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Good morning," he replied, his tone gentle, genuine. He paused near the atrium, where sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling. A few employees were setting up for a morning meeting. There was energy, warmth, connection. For years, he had walked through these same halls seeing only efficiency. Now, he saw people. The man who once built walls of glass now stood in a place full of light. Later that afternoon, as the sun broke through the clouds, James found himself drawn outside. He crossed the street to the plaza in front of the building, where the reflection of the tower shimmered across the polished windows. He stopped and looked up. For a long moment, he simply stood there watching the way the light danced along the surface, catching the movement inside. He could see people through the glass, not shadows, not outlines, but faces, real faces, laughter, movement, life, and for the first time, his own reflection wasn't the only thing staring back. He saw the receptionist waving to a colleague, two architects discussing a model near the window, a young intern clutching a notebook nervously, a version of himself, perhaps from long ago. Every reflection moved, intertwined, alive. The building he had once designed to be flawless had finally become what it was always meant to be: human. He thought of Evelyn then, not with longing, but with deep gratitude. She had become part of the air around him, not as absence, but as presence. Her words lingered, soft and steady, like a voice that lived inside his better self. "I'm not invisible anymore, James, not even to myself." He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight and grace of that truth settle in his chest. She had been right about everything, and now, after years of blindness, he could finally see. As the day faded, he returned to his office one last time. The view was the same, the skyline, the river, the fading glow of the sun, but what he saw within it was entirely new. He poured himself a cup of tea and stood by the window, watching the sky turn gold, then rose, then blue again. He thought about how some people come into our lives and stay constants we can rely on. Others come only for a time, to show us something we need to learn before they move on. And then there are the rare few, the ones who are both. The ones who stay not in body, but in lesson, in memory, in the quiet ways they change us forever. He lifted his cup slightly, almost like a silent toast. "To you, Evelyn," he murmured, "you taught me how to see." A quiet peace filled the room, not the empty peace of isolation, but the kind that follows healing. Outside, the city lights began to shimmer against the glass facade. James watched as the windows caught the glow, each pane holding a story, a reflection of someone within. He could see them clearly now, the people who made this place live and breathe. He smiled again, soft, content, whole. As he turned away from the window, his reflection blurred into theirs. There was no longer a separation between himself and the world beyond the glass. And perhaps, in that moment, that was the final lesson. That clarity isn't found in control or perfection, it's found in connection. That seeing the world isn't enough until you've learned to see its people, and that sometimes, one person's light is enough to illuminate a lifetime of blindness. That night, as James left the office, the building glowed behind him, not cold and silver as it once had, but golden, alive, full of warmth. He stepped out into the evening air, the sound of the river whispering faintly in the distance. The city lights reflected on the wet streets like scattered stars. He paused once more at the foot of the building, glancing back up at the windows. Inside, people moved, laughing, working, living, and he could see them clearly. Not just the shapes, not just the reflections, the people. And as the wind carried the soft scent of rain across the street, he smiled deeply, quietly, at peace. Because in a world once made of glass, he had finally learned to see through it. In the end, Evelyn's story isn't just about love. It's about the courage to be seen and the humility to see others. So many of us move through life the way she once did, quietly, doing what's right, keeping things together while the world rushes past without noticing. We think invisibility protects us from disappointment, but the truth is, it only keeps us from connection. And James, He reminds us that success without empathy is a kind of blindness. It's easy to control, to build walls, to lead with logic. But real strength, the kind that lasts, begins when we let those walls fall and choose compassion instead. If there's a lesson here, it's this: never underestimate the quiet souls. They are the anchors that hold the world steady, and never wait too long to tell someone, I see you, you matter, because sometimes the greatest gift you can give another human being and yourself is simply the act of seeing clearly. Through understanding, through forgiveness, through grace, we all find our way back to light. Thank you for spending this time with Shining Stories. If Evelyn's journey touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories that remind us of what truly matters: kindness, courage, and the quiet beauty of being human. Until next time, keep your heart open and never stop seeing the light in others.